Hi, greetings all. My name is Virginia Siegel, and I'm really grateful to the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History for allowing me to present today. I wanted to take a moment to say that I hope you all are doing well and staying well. It's a really challenging period of time for our nation and our region, and I think it makes the topic at hand all the more important to discuss. I just wanted to say that this isn't normally how I do presentations. I wish I could be engaging with you all in person and answering questions. And so I encourage you, my contact information is on the slide, and I'll also show it at the end of this presentation. Please feel free to reach out at any time with any questions or concerns, or if you'd just like to chat. And I'm showing a video here in the corner, but I think I'm going to reduce that for some slides, but I just wanted to say hi and show my face at the beginning so you have that in-person contact. But I just wanted to begin by saying that when the Shiloh Museum reached out to me about a talk, originally my topic was going to be quite different. I was just going to talk a little bit about folk arts throughout the state of Arkansas. However, a lot has changed very rapidly in the last few months. And so today I'm going to talk about a specific project that I'm working on called COVID-19 or documenting COVID-19. So this is a collaboration with the University of Arkansas Special Collections. I am with Arkansas Folk and Traditional Arts. We are a state folk arts program housed in University of Arkansas libraries. And so it's an internal collaboration, but it's open to all throughout the state. All right, so today, just to give you a little bit of an overview, I know because it's a video, it's helpful to have that orientation. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit more about who we are and what we do. This is actually an abbreviated form of the talk I might have given before COVID-19. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific topic at hand today. I'm going to introduce our project, Documenting COVID-19. And then I'm going to talk about why this project is important. Why are we doing it? And why now? Why not waiting until after this pandemic is over and we can look back with historical perspective? Why now? And then you're probably wondering, so our name is Arkansas Folk and Traditional Arts. What do we do, and what does this project have to do with folk and traditional arts? So we're going to talk about that, and then I'm going to finish the presentation by sharing how you can participate. We'd love for you to participate and share your experience to this project. And so, at a glance, Arkansas Folk and Traditional Arts is, like I mentioned, a statewide folk arts program housed in the University of Arkansas libraries. You may have heard of the Arkansas Folklife Program housed at Arkansas State. That disbanded several years ago, and we are actually the successor to that program. So while we are very new, we've been around for about a year, the state folk arts program in Arkansas is not new. It has existed in various forms from its original home in the Arkansas Arts Council. For a time it was at the Texarkana Regional Arts and Humanities Council, and then at Arkansas State University, and so its latest iteration, and we hope one that is long and successful, will be here at the University of Arkansas. And so our mission, I'm going to read it for you because I think it's very important, every word. AFTA is dedicated to building cross-cultural understanding by documenting, presenting, and sustaining Arkansas's living traditional arts and cultural heritage. AFTA develops and supports projects and programming for and featuring Arkansas citizens from all walks of life, with an emphasis on including underrepresented communities and traditions. So you'll see that first sentence, three prongs, documenting, presenting, and sustaining Arkansas's living traditional arts and cultural heritage. So how do we do that? First, let me take a step back and share with you a little bit of background. So we don't exist in a vacuum. Most states have a state folk arts or folklore program. In a lot of states, it still remains housed in the Arts Council or Humanities Council. We're one of a collection where it's housed at a university. But the folks who head these programs and who we work with are professional folklorists. So there is a strong field of folklore. It's a very the field has been going on for a long time. For instance, our professional society is the American Folklore Society, and the American Folklore Society has been in existence since 1888. It's one of the oldest academic institutions in the United States. So, since 1888. So I could talk a little bit more about folklorists and the history of that, but for now, I'm going to leave you with a link to our professional society, afsnet.org. It's there on the slide, and that's where you can learn more about the field more generally. There's lots of folklorists doing all kinds of work across the country, but typically we tend to speak of them divided amongst two sort of fields. There's folklorists working in academic settings as professors and researchers, and then there's folklorists like myself who are working in the public realm. So that's overly simplified. There's lots of folklorists doing all kinds of things, but for now I just wanted to share that. And so public folklorists working in the community do all kinds of things, but state folklorists have been in existence since the 80s. And so we are part of that history here at Arkansas Folk and Traditional Arts. So I mentioned those three prongs: document, present, and sustain. So how do we do these things? We document folk and traditional arts through fieldwork, oral histories, and the documentation of Arkansas's diverse traditions. We present, so we document. Great. Some of that documentation is put into the archive here at the University of Arkansas Special Collections. But we take that a step further, and we offer public programs, workshops for community members, and we also aim to provide curriculum for Arkansans of all ages and backgrounds. And then sustain. This is the most important aspect of our work. We're trying to create an environment where folks feel encouraged to sustain the traditions that they would like to sustain, those traditions that they feel are important. Not every tradition has to survive, and that's okay. But for the folks who wish to carry on their traditions, we want to provide resources and help and encouragement. And so, taking a step back, I've said a few things. I've said folk and traditional arts. I've said folklore. I've said traditional art. I've said tradition. How are these all related? I'm using these words somewhat interrelated, or I should say, sort of equating them and using them interchangeably. But they all have slightly different meanings. But suffice to say that as a folklorist, what we're interested in is traditions that exist within communities in Arkansas, meaning they come from the communities within which they're practiced, and they are learned within those communities. So that sets it apart from, for instance, things we learn in an academic setting from a textbook. No, these are traditions that have been handed down within the communities within which we operate. And community can be a broad term. So communities can mean geographic locations, our neighborhood. They can mean familial groups, our family unit. They can also be age cohorts. So, the culture of high school is very different than the culture of elementary school or the culture of adults. They can also be occupational groups or religious groups. So because we're called Arkansas Folk and Traditional Arts, and we also tend to do a lot of presenting, we oftentimes focus on folklore or tradition with an artful component, an artful focus. And what that means is that the community within which the tradition is practiced, they have a specific standard that they decide about what it means for this to be a good version of this tradition, or maybe a poorly executed version of this tradition. And so that's what we mean by an artful tradition. And that's really rather broad. That's broader, I think, than most people think when they're talking about arts. So that could mean everything from those folk arts you are more likely to expect, like quilting and folk music and dance. But it could also mean things like baking. We definitely have a right or a wrong way of baking. And other areas of our traditional life. So we can think broadly here at Arkansas Folk and Traditional Arts about folklore, but we tend to focus on tradition with an artful component. And so common forms of fieldwork that we do, and the reason why this is important for me to explain is this gives you some background for the project I'm going to talk about. For us to do that document prong of our mission, we often participate in participant observation. What that means is that I help someone quilt. I learn from them, and by participating in that process, I learn about what that tradition means to that community. So it's more meaningful to participate rather than just observe as sort of a stranger in the corner. Field notes and journaling. I write down what I'm seeing, what I'm learning from community members across Arkansas. I often take photographs. Video less frequently, but that is important. So especially when you're talking about a tradition that's performative, like dance or music, or even, for instance, the Peerage Mule Jump, which I loved attending. Photos might not do that justice. And then the subject of the project I want to talk about with you today centers on oral history interviews. How is that different from just a typical regular interview, not an oral history interview? Well, we're going to talk about that next. So here's the project at hand, documenting COVID-19. So the University of Arkansas Library Special Collections and AFTA, that's the shorthand for my organization, we're seeking to preserve the personal experiences of University of Arkansas students, faculty, and staff during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, AFTA, that's for my part, I'm broadening that. I have a statewide mission, so I'm interested in hearing how COVID-19 has affected all Arkansans across the state. So I mentioned I was going to talk about why now. Why not wait until this is ended and we have some more perspective on it all? Well, there is this trend amongst museums and archives called contemporary collecting, and it's really important. And I stole this definition from a museum in Texas, the Brenham Heritage Museum in Texas, because I thought it was particularly helpful. They write on their website, and the source is at the bottom of the slide, quote, "The process through which museums identify and acquire contemporary, tangible, and intangible culture in order to preemptively fill anticipated gaps in museum collections," end quote. And then this is taken from their website as well, they add, the basic idea is to get it now, get it while you still can, as it will be harder to get later. So how does that fit for oral histories? Oral histories aren't objects per se, they're stories and memories shared by people in an interview. The reason why that's important is the way we remember things, the way we look back on things changes over time as we age. And there's also this phenomenon that folklorists especially are interested in when talking about narratives surrounding disaster or traumatic events. And I'm sure other fields look at this, but there's this idea that over time we tend to collapse our experience, or at least how we describe our experience, to fit an available narrative. And what that means is we hear other people's experience who went through a similar situation, and we start to sort of use the same words and phrases that everyone else is using to explain what happened to us. And because of that, we lose a lot of the nuance of what we individually actually experienced during a trauma or a disaster, or honestly even just memories in general. And so the reason why it's important to collect now is because we don't want to lose that nuance. A lot of what's happening to us now, actually it might really seem mundane to us because it's our day-to-day life right now, but it's incredibly important details, and it's not going to be mundane or obvious to researchers in the future. And so collecting now, we get to keep a lot of those details that we might lose over time. That's not to say that you can't interview. I think there is something interesting and important about perspective, looking back on history too. So from my perspective, I would advocate for interviewing someone twice then, interviewing them now to find out what it's like to live during COVID-19, and then interview someone years from now to find out how they remember it, do they think about it differently? Has worse or better things happened since then that puts some perspective on that? I think that's really interesting to have both. So never discount collecting now. And then I promised to talk about, what does this have to do with our mission? Well, I have to say, mission aside, what's happening right now is so altering to us all at the core that we wanted to set aside our mission, and just because we have the capability of doing this documentation and this collecting. So we wanted to sort of be on the front lines of folks offering those services and getting collecting people's stories and memories. And that by itself is important and timely. But I will say that it is still relevant to our mission as well, though. A lot of folks, not everyone, I don't want to sort of homogenize people's experience, but a lot of folks right now have a lot more time on their hands. And we're seeing a resurgence in folks practicing hobbies or traditions that are important to them. Maybe it's that you finally have time to sit down and get to some sewing you haven't had time to do before. Or maybe you're revisiting family traditions like baking bread and trying new things. Maybe you're picking up totally new hobbies and watching YouTube videos. These are all artful practices and traditions that we're using sort of this moment of collective confusion and uncertainty and sort of making peace with that by practicing these traditions. We have an intern right now at AFTA who's looking at how folks have started gardening more, both for practical reasons to create food source during the pandemic, but also it's a cathartic practice and it's a sense of community. Also, we have a little more time to do it. But a particularly iconic example I want to leave you with right now is, right now, what's the most important thing everybody's been trying to get their hands on, aside from toilet paper? It's been masks. And a lot of those masks are coming from people who are sitting at home practicing the tradition of sewing. And oftentimes, too, it's quilters. So, for instance, we have a group up here in Northwest Arkansas, Loose Threads, who I think to date have, as a group, collectively made over 3,000 masks for folks in the community. So that's amazing, and that's an amazing use of a traditional skill set like sewing and quilting. So folk arts, excuse me, I can't talk. Folk arts and COVID-19, there's actually a really important relationship there. So for our project today, that I'm going to share more details with as we unfold, I wanted to first note who could participate. You know, I mentioned that there's a component of the project that started in collaboration with Special Collections that's really geared more towards University of Arkansas folks. And the reason why that is because that's actually being spearheaded by the university archivist, Amy Allen. So it's not to be exclusionary, it's just her job is to think as a university archivist, how is this pandemic affecting the university community? However, we've teamed up on several projects, but we've teamed up again because we're recognizing that this isn't just affecting folks in the university community, it's affecting everyone across the state and nation. And so that's where my part comes in, collecting oral histories for anyone across the state of Arkansas. But it's important to talk about, I'm going to show some slides here, it's important to talk about who to go to depending on what aspect of the project you're interested in. So if you are student, faculty, or staff, and I would say alumni as well, Amy's actually collecting a lot more than I am. She has a lot more bandwidth to do this. So she's collecting everything from journals and photos and maybe screenshots of social media, as well as oral histories that I'm helping to facilitate. If you fall into that category and you have documents or photos or you would like to share an oral history, you can go to our website for this particular aspect of the project, uark.libguides.com/documenting COVID-19, and the link's here on the slide. This is where you would go to find out what forms you need and how to submit. Both Amy and I's contact information is on that website, so I'm going to share a couple different websites today, but no matter which one you go to, don't worry, you're still going to find ways to access both aspects of the project. However, if you fall into the category of non-university affiliated and you would like to participate, your experience is just as important. I'm just going to direct you to a different website. So I mentioned Amy has more bandwidth than I do. I typically collect oral histories first and foremost, so that's what we're focusing on for this aspect of the project. That said, I do want to leave a caveat. If you have journal articles or maybe photos or you want to talk about other things you'd like to share, reach out to me at my contact information that I shared at the beginning and at the end of the slide. Let's talk about it. It's just a little bit more out of my wheelhouse when I'm not the one creating, for instance, the photographs, etc. So it doesn't mean it can't happen, it just means it hasn't really been our focus for this project. If you'd like to participate and you're not a member of the university community, this is the link we encourage you to go to, folklife.uark.edu/documenting COVID-19. Let me repeat that because I fumbled over it a little bit. Excuse me, folklife.uark.edu/documenting-COVID-19. Now those dashes between documenting COVID and 19 are important. I apologize, it's a little unwieldy, but if you don't put those dashes, then you're not going to get the right link. This is the website for AFTA, and this, like the university's website, has contact information and advice for how you submit your materials. So we've talked about what we're collecting and where you go to participate, but that still doesn't tell you exactly what an oral history is or exactly what it means to participate by sharing an oral history. So that's what we're going to talk about next. I'm going to talk about what an oral history is next, but I want to give out a few options first. Because we're going through a pandemic right now, what an oral history is actually looks a little different. Fundamentally, it's not different. It's just where and how we meet to conduct it. So typically, when I conduct oral history interviews, I meet with someone in person because these are meant to be comfortable conversations. And it's really hard to do that over the internet. However, because we're going through an extraordinary time right now, we're collecting oral histories for this project remotely, which means that I'm collecting interviews using my computer. Because there's a couple ways to participate in this project. If you'd like me to interview you, that's certainly an option. And the website that I shared tells you what that can look like and how to reach out to me. Or you could simply email me at the contact information I provided. So that's an option. We can converse over our computers and I interview you or someone that you would like to put me in contact with. A second option is if you would like, you could interview folks within your family. Now, here's an important caveat. If you choose to do that, please follow CDC recommendations for safety and staying healthy during this pandemic. Please only interview people within your quarantine circle so you don't risk spreading the virus. If you would prefer to just have yourself be interviewed, but you don't want me necessarily to do it too, this is where we're sort of deviating from standard oral history protocol. A third option is that you can record a video of yourself and you can go through a list of questions in front of you and answer them yourself. The reason why it's not quite the same as an oral history is there isn't someone interviewing you, and we'll talk about what those differences are. But like I said, this is an extraordinary time. We can only do what's possible and what's safe. And so that is certainly a third option available to you. So I've still talked a lot around what an oral history is. So let's talk about that. So what is an oral history? This definition on the slide I'm borrowing from the Kentucky Oral History Commission because I think it's nice and concise and simple. It is simply a recorded dialogue between two people that captures personal memories of historic significance. So the great question here is, we talked a little bit about memory earlier. When you're doing an oral history, are you trying to collect fact? I think different scholars who use oral history as a tool have differing emphasis on this. Oral historians are usually seeking facts about the past, accurate historical narratives. Folklorists, we tend to emphasize more, we're trying to see, we're more interested in seeing the world from the perspective of the person being interviewed. And so that includes meanings, the interviewee's thoughts, and what the memories hold for, the importance the memories hold for them. So this is especially important when you're interviewing someone who's maybe looking back on a memory with quite some distance in between. We're less concerned about those things we can look up online and find out, oh, this was the exact date. And we're more interested in what maybe those historical events mean to a person. So there's a little bit of difference there. I want to emphasize, you might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm not an oral historian. I don't know how to use a recorder. That's okay. You can totally still capture your family's stories. So here's a few things to consider before you begin. Who will you interview? Like I mentioned, do you want to be the interviewee, or do you have family members that you'd like to interview? What equipment will you use? I mentioned earlier that if you're going to interview people in your family to follow CDC guidelines, well, I was thinking in that case that's because you're interviewing people in person, but you could also interview people via the computer as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about what kinds of equipment we can use, especially during COVID-19, and I'll share with you what I use. So you know what you're going to use, you know who you're going to interview. The most important thing then is what questions are you going to ask. So we're going to talk a little bit about question development here as well. And then fourth, and I cannot stress this enough, is to follow CDC guidelines for safety. This project's important, but not so important that we should risk making others ill, even if on accident. So let's start with what equipment will you use? I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the ideal situation in a world without COVID, and then a little bit about what we're doing in the meantime during the pandemic. But regardless of the situation, there's two things I want you to consider. And I sort of have these inverted because the first thing really should be what can you afford or borrow? And the reason why that's first is because you might be able to afford or borrow a really nice piece of equipment, and that's not going to matter if you're not comfortable using it. So these are two important factors. What can you afford or borrow? But more importantly, what are you comfortable using? And the reason why that's important is, for instance, on this slide, I have a variety of options of professional recording equipment. And on the left-hand side, the Tascam, these are prices actually from B&H photo website. It's a website for buying equipment for photography and videography. It's where we buy our equipment. Or I shouldn't say that, we're not promoting B&H, but it's where I happened to buy my equipment. But that's where these prices come from, just to give you an idea of what the cost is for this equipment. Going back to the previous slide, this Tascam on the left-hand side, which is what I use, is a phenomenal device. It does an amazing job. It gives me a lot of options for manipulating sound quality and making sure that it's at its very best. So that way I can use recordings for programs or production, and I can also ensure that they're at the highest level of quality for archival storage. That said, there's a lot of features on this Tascam. And it's probably a little unwieldy for someone who's less interested in knowing the intricacies of, sound technology and more just interested in quickly capturing the stories of people around them that are important. This middle slide, I just wanted to include this, the H1N, because it is a definite sort of more middle range, more affordable option. So if this presentation sparks something in you and you'd like to pursue this, first I'd encourage you to talk with me, but also this would certainly be a device that's a little bit easier to use and a lot more affordable, but still has great capabilities. I should note in between those two recorders, the 269 item, that's actually an external microphone that I use with my Tascam. And to the right of the H1N, that's actually a different, I just wanted to show a different version of an external microphone. That's a microphone that you would pin to your lapel so the microphone stays right close to the interviewee's mouth. And then I wanted to include, especially right now for COVID-19, this third recorder, which, as you may guess, is actually your cell phone. So if you have a smartphone, smartphones these days are amazing pieces of equipment, and they can actually record pretty good sound quality as well. So different phones have different apps, so I can't give you necessarily a quick answer for that, but I encourage you to reach out to me because there are certain apps that folklorists have recommended over others, some that are free, some that have a minor cost, and there are different settings you might want to finagle in your phone to make sure that you're getting the best out of the app. So that's a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but feel free to reach out if you have questions and I'll do my best. I'm also going to provide some resources at the end that places you can go to read up on some of that yourself. Okay, so ideally we're meeting with folks in person and using some of the recorders I mentioned in the previous slide. But we can't do that right now. I can't travel across the state and meet with folks in their homes. I don't want to risk making anyone sick or me getting sick and passing it on to my loved ones. So what I'm doing right now is I'm interviewing using my laptop, and I'm doing video phone calls through my laptop to folks and recording it on my computer while we talk. So some of the apps I'm using right now are Zoom, Microsoft Teams, or Google Hangouts. These are all really cool apps. Some are free, some are not, because there's more than what's shown here. But the key is to find an app that works for you, that you can afford, that you can figure out how to use, and look for a few features. If you're going to use some of these apps, here's the things that you're looking for. You need an app that has the ability to record a conversation. Not just allow you to have a conversation, but allow you to record while you're talking. You also want to find an app that will allow you to download the file after you've made it. So you've made a recording. Some apps, they allow you to listen to it, but only in that app. No, we want to be able to download it as a file to your computer. And then something else that's really important is ideally, when you download it to your computer, it's in a file format that's recognizable, like an MP3 or an MP4. And I'll mention that here again in the next few slides. If you have questions about that, again, as always, feel free to reach out. But the most important thing is that you can do those three functions with the app. I hope Cliff doesn't mind. I'm borrowing a quote that he said recently in a meeting. Cliff is the Director of Folk and Traditional Arts at the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts. He emphasized, we were talking about doing programming during this unprecedented time, and he just mentioned, and I took this to heart, the idea that we can only do what's possible and safe. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because in a perfect world, I'd be fiddling with a recorder to make sure I get the absolute best sound. I'd be really picky about it, and that's just not possible right now. What's important right now is to collect these stories, and everything else sort of falls by the wayside. So that's all to say that if you're like me, you may be a perfectionist, you might be worried about it, but we can't afford to be perfectionists right now. We just have to make do and do our best and stay safe. So you've fiddled around with your computer, maybe you've reached out to me and got some ideas for what equipment to use, and now you're ready to do the interview. So here's what I want you to do when you prep for the interview. If you're interviewing someone that's not yourself, I want you to be really clear and transparent about the process. And what I mean is that if you're interviewing someone who isn't going through this presentation maybe with you and doesn't know what this is going to look like, I want you to describe what this process will look like. Describe that the interview is not going to be a quick one. It's not going to be 5 or 10 minutes. It's maybe going to be 30 minutes. And that there's going to be paperwork involved, which we'll talk about here in a minute. The thing I want to emphasize most is that when it comes to oral histories, the most important thing is making your interviewee comfortable. And so I want you to just share all this information from the get-go when you're asking them if they want to be interviewed, so that way they're not walking into something where they feel ambushed. The other thing you can do is if it's someone you're not very familiar with, and actually I should take this bullet point out. This is sort of from a slide, this is a slide I would use sort of outside of COVID-19, but if it's someone you're not very familiar with, I'd encourage you to conduct a pre-interview. That's not recorded, but it's just an opportunity for you to get to know the person a little bit and figure out, use that to help you develop questions. So next, before the interview, you're going to develop a list of questions. So the website that I've shared with you before, AFTA's website, has a list of questions we've already written that you can borrow from. You don't have to stick to them. You don't have to get to all of them. In fact, you probably won't, and that's okay. And feel free to create your own. I will say that if someone wants to see questions beforehand, we typically discourage that, and that's only because I don't want folks sort of pre-practicing their answers. The more organic and in the moment, the better. But I know this is a very nerve-wracking process. So if someone wants to see questions, you might share with them some of them and let them know. You might get to those, you might not. And actually, while you're talking, you might think of new questions in the moment. That's okay. And so you're also going to gather your forms and equipment. And I'm going to talk about that at the end of the towards the end of the slideshow. What forms are required for us to be able to archive your interview? Lastly, well, not lastly, but you're going to decide on a location, even if it's in your home with a family member, or even if I'm interviewing you and you're using your computer. Try to find a place that's quiet, where you'll be uninterrupted. So I know that when we're working at home, it's almost impossible to find somewhere truly quiet, but just do your best. And then most importantly, before the interview begins, test your equipment. Maybe do a practice run with someone. Fiddle around with it, especially since it's on your computer, and make sure you feel really comfortable with it. So that way that's not in the back of your mind, and you can truly relax and enjoy and listen to your interviewee. So I have a few tips for things to think about during the interview. So make sure you give an introduction to the recording, and that's for the archivist. An example, so you hit record and you say, I'm going to give you an example as if I was the interviewer. So my name is Virginia Siegel. It's March 25th, 2020. I'm making this recording on WebEx online from my home in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I'm chatting online with my friend and colleague Amy Allen, who is located in her home in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Thanks for joining me, Amy. So that's a good introduction. That helps an archivist who's listening to the recording. Maybe the audio file has been separated from its documents. That helps them identify the recording. The who and the where. Make sure you include a where, but don't worry about exact date or exact addresses. I didn't give a specific address. I just mentioned that we're in Fayetteville, Arkansas. That's enough. That's enough. So once you get started, ask a softball question first. And what I mean is ask just a really simple, basic question. Something your interviewee is probably nervous. Give them a question they can't get wrong, like, where did you grow up? Like I said, we have example questions for you to borrow from. So some of these points are more just to give you an idea of how to craft questions, but just if you're nervous about that, you can always defer to our list. But continuing along for tips for asking questions, start a trend of long answers. And what I mean is try to avoid closed-ended questions. You'll see that down at the bottom of the slide. And try to avoid yes/no questions. You're wanting to elicit stories and memories. Yes/no questions are hard to do that. You want to ask questions that are really open-ended, like rather than where did you grow up, ask me. You could say, tell me about where you grow up. What was it like? So that gives an opportunity for more description, more stories, more memories. And then related to that, ask one question at a time. So, it's hard, you might not feel like you'd interviewed perfectly, and that's okay. I'm giving you tips and tricks, but I still feel like I get it wrong every time. Like I phrase something weird, or maybe a question doesn't make sense to my interviewee, or I don't follow my own rules. That's okay. I want you to feel comfortable during the process. This is just advice for making that process smooth and getting a successful interview. So I don't always do this right, but in a perfect world, I'd only ask one question at a time. Otherwise, it might sound something like, so tell me about where you were born, what year was it, and what was it like living in the countryside and having so many siblings. When you ask something like that, that can get confusing and unwieldy for your interviewee, and they might forget what all you even asked. So try to break those up into discrete questions. And, confirm you are listening nonverbally. This is really an artifact from the fact that we often use these interviews for exhibits or maybe on the radio, and so we want to have as uninterrupted audio as possible. But I think it's just important in general because, years later when researchers listening to this interview, it's easier if the interviewee's thoughts aren't interrupted constantly by or oh, that's interesting, verbal confirmation. And I naturally like to give verbal confirmation, so this very much goes against my nature, and I have to be very careful about this. But try to confirm that you're listening non-verbally, head nods, things like that. And importantly, be okay with silence. So if you're like me, I kind of grew up in a home environment where we sort of always talked a lot, and where we couldn't really ever have silence. Someone's always got to fill it with something. So this is also hard for me, but I promise you'll find that if you wait an extra beat, even beyond what feels comfortable, oftentimes your interviewee may continue their thought. Maybe they're thinking, maybe, memories are coming back fresh as they're sharing the story. So give your interviewees time to have those memories and pause in between thoughts. If you interrupt, you might accidentally disrupt a thought. You might not get as much detail as you thought you would have. And related, try to handle tangents gracefully. The nature of an oral history is we're asking people to share memories and stories, which means that they could take it in any number of directions. And so someone might be answering a question not quite how you thought they would answer it, and that's okay. That is totally okay. That might trigger another memory that takes them down a completely different path. Let it happen. Because you never know what you're going to get, and what's most important is what your interviewee wants to share and what they feel comfortable sharing. So at worst, if you still want to try to re-ask the question, don't interrupt. Write down your questions and follow up, return to them later. And then try not to ask leading questions, and what I mean by that is try not to sort of have an assumption in your mind about how they may answer, and then phrase your question in a way that leads to that answer. So for instance, saying, working from home has been really hard, hasn't it? So tell me about why this has been a difficult time. Well, you're already sort of assuming that it's been a difficult experience, and then your interviewee is automatically going to try to fit their answer into your expectation. So rather than do that, just say, how has it been working from home? What's this been like for you? Then you're leaving the interpretation to them. I include ask for specific examples because it might help elicit more memories, but also keep in mind that this is an audio medium, so if someone uses an acronym maybe that a researcher might find unfamiliar, maybe ask them to clarify that. Or maybe I found people sometimes do they do measurements visually, and if someone's listening to it, that's not going to make sense to them. So say maybe someone holds their hands up to say, oh, it was yay big. That would be your opportunity to say, oh, so you think about a foot, is that what you mean? Yeah, I think it was about a foot long. So that's just ways for a researcher who's listening but not watching can interpret what they mean. Finally, look for signs of exhaustion. You may think that your interview is going to last a certain length of time or that you're going to get through all your questions, but memory work is hard, even for the recent past. This experience has been emotional for a lot of people. And so if someone, it seems like they're exhausted or it's just a good time to end, even if you don't get to all your questions, end it. It's the comfort of your interviewee is most important. You can always do a follow-up interview if you want to return to it and ask more questions. And so we're running out of time because I'm timing my slide and I don't want to make this presentation too long. So I just wanted to share, here are some example questions. I would have normally read through them, but I don't want to take up too much time today. You can pause the video and read through them yourself, but keep in mind, these are example questions from the question document that we provide on our website. So this is just 5 questions, but we actually have a dozen plus questions for you to use if you'd like to participate. And then I wanted to just do a quick note, interviewing family and friends. What's tricky about that? Shouldn't that make it easier? And by nature of this project and us being quarantined, we're going to be likely interviewing family and friends. A few things to keep in mind. If you're quarantined with someone, there might be that assumed knowledge. They are going to assume that you know details, and so they might not provide those details for the interview. And these are details that aren't going to be obvious to a researcher. So you want to sort of prep them to share this interview with you as if you were a stranger, even though obviously you're not. And part of that too is references that are only going to make sense to you and your group or the community that you're a part of. There might also be a reluctance to repeat stories from family or friends because they know that you should already know those stories. And, going back to leading questions, as an interviewer, you might be overly guided by what you already know about that person, and not sort of leave room for them to surprise you. And this is just a good point, especially when you're doing interview outside of COVID-19. Oops, let me go back. Oh, well, it's not going to let me go back, and I don't want to re-record this recording. I want this to feel really organic for you, but like I'm actually in the room. But that last point was just noting that when you're interviewing folks, who are maybe different from you in age or gender, the content you're going to get is going to be very different than if it's someone who's, very different from you in background and standing. So what I mean is that, if you're interviewing, and I shouldn't say standing, that's the wrong word, but if you're interviewing, for instance, your grandfather, and say maybe you're a young woman, what he's going to tell you is going to be very different than if you're interviewing, than if he was being interviewed maybe by a male son. I would like to think that's not the case, but I've done interviews, for instance, where it was a young mother who went through a very traumatic event, and her son was sitting in on the interview, and she felt very uncomfortable sharing those details because it's her son and she doesn't want him to know about the trauma that she went through. So these are just things to think about that might not necessarily apply to this project, but I just want you to feel equipped more generally about what it's like to do an oral history interview. And so finally, you finished your interview. Here's the follow-up. I'm going to talk about what forms you need to sign, don't worry, but make sure you have your form signed by you and your interviewees, and don't forget your parts. After the interview's over, back up your materials. So move your files to your computer, or if you have a hard drive or a thumb drive, great. The more files, the more redundancy, the better. Our computers fail us, our thumb drives fail us, so if you need to put it in 2 places, that's actually preferred. You're going to name your files clearly, so that way they make sense to you, and that they're easy for us, when you share them with us, they're easy for us to discern what's what and organize them. You're going to send a copy of your interview to your interviewee with a thank you note. That's reciprocity. That's thanking them for their time. And then you're going to send a copy to us. And then ideally, you're going to talk, hopefully you had a positive experience. So I'd love for you to pass the word along and encourage other folks in your network to participate as well. So what paperwork's required? We require 2 pieces of information. First is the deed of gift. That is you giving the interview to us so we can archive it. And the second piece is a participant information sheet. And basically what that is that's metadata for the interview. And I put a note about extra documentation. I don't want that to confuse you, but if you wanted to, for instance, share more details than what the form allows or include photos to illustrate points in the interview, all the extra documentation is always great. Certainly not required, but always great. And I want you to feel comfortable with this deed of gift. So these 2 forms are available to download at both the University Library Special Collections site as well as our site. And I can also email them to you if you have trouble accessing them. And they can be filled out online on the computer. So if you're interviewing someone via computer, you don't have to worry about getting a mailed, printed form. But I want you to understand what the forms are asking. So this deed of gift is actually saying that you donate to us legal title, including copyright, to the recordings, and that you grant to us all the rights you possess in those recordings, including all intellectual property rights. You sign, though, that I understand that the University of Arkansas Libraries grants me a non-exclusive license to make and to authorize others to make use of any of the content of those recordings. So what I wanted to just emphasize that what that means is that you still retain a copy and you're able to use the copy however you'd like, share it with whoever you'd like, but you're also giving us the right to use and own these recordings. If you have any more questions about that, that's a really simplistic and perhaps maybe too simplistic explanation, but I just want to emphasize that you still have your recordings and you're able to use them however you'd like as well. So you're letting us know that you're donating those files to us, and then this is the bottom of the form. I'm going to do a little, this is where the interviewer signs. So that if you're interviewing someone, this is where you would sign. This is where the interviewee signs, and then make sure to include an address for the interviewee. This is the second form, the participant information form. And I always tell people to include as much or as little as they feel comfortable. This form asks for a lot of information. It's okay if someone doesn't want to include all this information. The example I give is if there's 2 Jessica Joneses in the archive, the more information we have on the participant information form, the more we're able to tell if this was Jessica Jones born in 1980, or maybe this is the Jessica Jones born in 1950. The more information we have, the better we're able to discern between different people with the same name. But a word of caution, so here's the bottom of the form, for instance. We asked for, you could provide, your mother's maiden name. That's always very helpful for researchers, especially when it comes to genealogy. But if you don't feel comfortable including it, that's okay. Because keep in mind, for instance, that folks use their maiden name for security questions. So I just want to emphasize again, include as much or as little as you feel comfortable. And then for the files, the kind of files we would like you to use, I just wanted to know, in a world without COVID-19, the rule of thumb is to have raw files. Now that could be a whole separate presentation, but just as an example, a raw file extension for different kinds of formats are listed here. So, if you download a quick recording from your phone, it might be an MP3. That's not a raw file. For audio, a raw file is WAV, and what that means is it's uncompressed. An MP3 is actually your device compresses that sound so that way it takes up less storage, and as part of that it loses some of its archival quality. So in a perfect world, we would want raw, uncompressed files. But we're not living in a perfect world right now, or nor are we ever. But with COVID-19, that's harder to do. So the rule of thumb for this project is to do what's possible. So compressed files are fine. Just make sure that's files that are recognizable, standard file formats. Why? That makes it easier for our archivists to maintain and store those files over time. So here are some examples. For the sake of time, I'm going to move to the final slides, but you can always pause it and look at that, or have questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I wanted to just lastly share, where will your interviews live? You know, some features of a good repository are that it's climate controlled, it accepts and cares for files that were created digitally, you know, they never existed as a print file, which is true of oral histories. They employ trained personnel, they're open to the public in some form, and it makes sense for the project topic. You know, we already know where our repository is, but I wanted to give you some guidance about what a good repository is. But where will your interviews live? If you're participating in this particular project, they will live in the University of Arkansas Special Collections. And finally, I just want to give you some additional resources if you're interested in learning more about oral histories, about folklore. These are really your top-notch places to go. I include the Veterans History Project because it's a project at the Library of Congress where they're collecting oral histories from veterans. But they have a really great guide for that project that you can download, and while it's tailored to veteran stories, it's a great resource document. If you'd like to learn more about folklore, be certain to check out the American Folklore Society's site. And if you'd like to learn more about oral history, you can't go wrong with the Oral History Association. And they even have some guidelines out right now about interviewing during COVID-19 or doing remote interviews. And I've actually linked to those from our website for the project, so you can get there from that as well. And lastly, I just want to leave you with the link for the project again. So folklife.uark.edu/documenting-COVID-19. All the things I've mentioned are there. Links to additional resources. The fieldwork forms, so like the deed of gift and the participant information form, those you can download from there. The sample questions, advice and tips, everything you could need is at this link, including my contact information. So this is your go-to link if you'd like to participate. Now, if this was an in-person interview, I'd open up for questions, but obviously it's not. So please, 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 please feel free to reach out to me. I am literally here to be a resource for you. That's my job. So don't be shy. I'd love for you to participate. But again, if you have any questions about any step of the process, please let me know. So thank you so much for watching this. Please pass it along. A huge thank you to the Shiloh Museum for allowing me this opportunity. It's a real honor. And please, everyone, just stay safe and be safe and healthy. So thank you so much.